Hello, everyone. This is Morgan Livingston with Pennsylvania FarmLink. Thank you for joining us today. Today, our topic is navigating the produce safety landscape, specifically related to GAP certification. This is the second webinar in our series as part of the PA FarmLink wholesale buying project to help farmers navigate and enter the wholesale market if that's a way that they're looking to expand their produce operation. Our first webinar was last week, and we gave an introduction to some of the requirements and preferences we found while we were interviewing and working with wholesale buyers, and also introducing you to several great organizations across Pennsylvania and the Northeast region that help with a lot of the topics that you will need as you're entering the wholesale market. One of those was Chesapeake Harvest, and we have Lindsay Gilmour here today from Chesapeake Harvest to dive more into GAP certification. GAP certification was maybe the most common preference or requirement that we found across all types of wholesale buyers, from smaller to larger grocery change and distribution centers. And we felt like it was also an area that can be intimidating or confusing, especially to producers that are new to this wholesale marketing space. So we felt like it warranted a follow-up webinar to go a little bit more deeply into that and kind of give an introduction to everything with GAP certification and first steps that farmers should plan to take as they enter this space. Just a quick reminder that we are really grateful to the Specialty Crop Block Grant program for sponsoring this whole project. And there are also toolbox resources, the past webinar recording, those can be found on the PA FarmLink website, and we'll share those links at the end if you'd like to check those out. We're thankful for Connor Schutte from Voyage Media Works, who's running the webinar piece behind the scenes. And specifically, thank you to Lindsay for being our presenter today. Lindsay is a consultant both with Chesapeake Harvest and the owner of Organic Planet LLC. She is a produce safety consultant that helps farmers navigate the sometimes intimidating and confusing world of produce safety programs. She is trained in Produce GAP's harmonized food safety standards, is a qualified auditor for the USDA Group GAP program, and is a lead trainer for the PSA Grower Training Program. I have participated in several of Lindsay's trainings and also worked with her on some food safety programs and food safety plans. And I found her to be really informative, but also very approachable in helping make this topic more approachable for farmers. And she was the first person we thought of to teach this webinar. Really grateful that she was making the time to do this. So without further ado, we'll let Lindsay get into her program today.
Thank you, Morgan. Hi, everybody. So as Morgan said, very kindly, I am a produce safety educator, produce safety consultant. I work with a program in the mid-Atlantic called Chesapeake Harvest, but I also work with other organizations around the country. I'm just starting a new project with the Food Hub Network out in the Northwest. I do all kinds of things in all kinds of places. It's interesting where food safety has taken me. I'm actually a chef by training, so I've had food safety training throughout my career, but jumping into helping farmers sell to wholesale markets back in 2000, there are lots of barriers and lots of challenges on the buyer side and the farmer side. And we were always trying to help farmers through the biggest barrier, whatever it might be. And food safety around 2011, food safety really raised its head as the biggest barrier for farmers to sell into the larger wholesale marketplace. And so I've just been working on food safety with farmers since then in various different ways. So as Morgan said, produce safety can be very intimidating. I found this photo somewhere along the line. It felt like, how do you find a road through this swamp of food safety terminology, food safety requirements, etc.? So one question I had for those of you who are participating is, if you are planning to get GAP certified in the future, would you put that in the chat? Also, if you are thinking that you have to comply with the FSMA produce safety rule. Could you put that in the chat as well? And that I'll take a look at the chat in a little bit and just see if any of you are grappling with those things, GAP certification or compliance with the FSMA produce safety rule, and that'll help me focus a little bit as we go along today. So why produce safety? Why now? It doesn't hurt to reiterate this. Some of the things I say today you will have heard before, but one of the things I have learned for my own learning around food safety and everybody else that I have helped and mentored and trained is repetition is key, because it's really hard to absorb everything and every reason and every requirement all in one go. So oftentimes there's a lot of repetition, but hopefully you'll come away today with 3 or 4 things that are useful to you. So the kind of most obvious thing is we eat far more produce raw than we ever have before in the history of human beings. Mostly we were eating a lot of cooked food until really the century before this. And then more recently, we have a lot more packaged, fresh cut and ready to eat fruits and vegetables. And they pose a whole different kind of risk, including the fact that they come out of the larger aggregation and wider distribution system of the global food chain, the global food supply chain. We're aggregating millions and millions of pounds of produce. So if you've got pathogens just on one farm and they go into the larger aggregation system, then they get spread at a scale that we've never experienced before. The other thing is that there are pathogens that weren't previously associated with fresh produce. So E. coli 0157H7 actually comes really out of the confined animal farming industry. It's a new strain of E. coli, and it's the one that most commonly causes foodborne illness, in especially salad vegetables. And we've heard, the last few years, romaine has been the biggest culprit. We recently had salmonella on onions. It's really the first time anyone has heard of salmonella on onions at the farm level. Prepared chopped onions, yes, because there's lots of opportunities for contamination once you start processing something, but actually to have them coming out of the field with salmonella was unusual. Norovirus is one of those. These are just examples. There are others as well, but norovirus is, like COVID, is spread from person to person through the respiratory system. So that's really more people being sick at the farm level or at the restaurant and so on. Listeria on cantaloupes. Listeria it's a relatively relative newcomer, but listeria is very prevalent everywhere. All of these things are prevalent everywhere. Different strains of these things are prevalent everywhere. Some of them are pathogenic, some of them aren't. But you probably all remember the cantaloupe listeria outbreak back in 2010, which ended a farm business completely in Colorado. And then MRSA can be spread through animal products, through produce, through water, all the other ways that the other bacteria can be spread. And it's one of those antibiotic resistant bacteria. So we can't control what comes from the outside. So even if we have a biodynamic or organic or, a farm where we feel like we're producing food that is going to create the greatest health and nutrition in our community, we still have to be careful when it comes to pathogens in our food system and on our produce. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing the most nutritious and healthy food possible, because, most people are not getting sick, but people do not expect to get sick from eating their salad. So because of this increased awareness of foodborne illness and increased prevalence of foodborne illness, the Food Safety Modernization Act came into being. President Obama signed it into being in 2011, and then there are actually 7 regulations that came out of that are part of the Food Safety Modernization Act, and they control primary production, processing, transportation, foreign supply, imported foods. And the one, though, that affects produce farmers is the produce safety rule. before there was FSMA, there was GAP certification, and that's what I'm going to focus on the most today. So the FSMA was really reassurance for consumers who are concerned about foodborne illness. There is actually a group called, what are they called? No foodborne illness, something like that. They're very, very, very passionate about their family members not getting sick and dying. And they put a lot of pressure on all the powers that be to ramp up food safety in the food system. So Food Safety Modernised Act FSMA was driven by consumers. GAP certification was driven by buyers, by big buyers. It started in Europe and it spread all around the world now. So there are GAP certification programs in most countries. Some of them are using global food safety standards. Some of them have, I come from New Zealand. New Zealand has its own New Zealand GAP, Canada GAP. There's many different programs out there. So just a quick, I know that you talked about FSMA last week, but just quickly, FSMA is FDA regulations, as I said, for food production, transport, and foreign supply verification. The regulation that applies to produce farmers is the produce safety rule. And through this program, there are free on-farm readiness reviews that you can get, usually through, in Pennsylvania anyway, through the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. And then the inspection that comes after that is also free. So the produce safety rule at this time, there's no charge for inspections. There's no charge for the readiness review. You do have to pay to go to a grower training, and somebody on the farm at a management level there always has to be someone at the farm at a management level who has taken this PSA grower training, is actually the only official FDA approved training. And FSMA is the law. So if you are covered, meaning if you have to comply, you must comply. They use the word covered as a legalese term. Means that what the circumstances at your farm require you to comply with this law. Oops. So just quickly going over who can be exempt. If the produce grown on the farm is just for personal or on-farm consumption, you're fully exempt. If all the produce that you grow on your farm is in the list of rarely consumed raw, meaning things like potatoes, sweet potatoes, winter squash, eggplant, and things that you think of that really have to be cooked to be eaten, then you're fully exempted. That's all you grow. If you grow eggplant and raspberries, then you may not be exempt. If your produce is being grown and then processed in some way to eliminate risk. So if it undergoes a kill step, cooking, canning, fermentation, certain kinds of pickling, then again, it's fully exempt. Although, yeah, I'm not going to go into too many details. Well, you can ask me if you want more detail. And if the average gross of the previous 3 years' sales of produce is less than, it's now around 28,000 because it's adjusted for inflation. So 28,000 per year on average over the last 3 years, then you're fully exempt. There is, if you, and I'm going to go to not exempt at all, if you're completely covered. What do I say there? If you must comply, it means that the sales of all the food that you produce is greater than 500,000. That means covered produce. So it's produce that's typically eaten raw or raw agricultural commodities. And if your sales of that are greater than 500,000, then that's all you grow. Or the sales of all food, including covered produce, is less than 500,000, but more than 50% of what you grow is sold to what are called intermediated markets, so sold to a distributor, sold to a food hub that is not owned by the farmers who sell to it, sold to warehouse for a supermarket chain. So rather than going to the back door of the supermarket, you're going to a warehouse where they aggregate their product. Then if you're selling, even if you're selling less than $500,000 in food, you still have to comply. And then there's this middle ground called qualified exempt. And that means your 3 years sales average of all food produced, including raw agricultural commodities, is less than 500,000, more than 28,000, less than 500,000, and more than 50% of the food that you sell goes to qualified end users, meaning CSA, farmers market, direct to a restaurant, direct to a grocery store, in any way. So basically, the qualified end user is either the person that's eating it or it's the business that's selling it to the person that's eating it. As opposed to these other markets or intermediated markets, you sell to a distributor who then sells to the store, who then sells to someone who's eating it. They didn't make this simple, I just have to say. There's more details in there that I can get into if somebody needs it, but the key thing is understanding. Oh, and if you're qualified exempt, there are a couple of things you have to do. Mainly, you have to have records to prove that you're qualified exempt. So financial records to show where your food is going, who it's being sold to, and the breakdown of percentages of who it's sold to. And then you have to have the name of the farm and the business address of the farm, either on the point of sale somewhere. If you have a sign at the farmer's market, you have it on your sign, or have it on a sign at the farmer's market. Or if you're selling to a restaurant or something like that, or people are picking up boxes at a CSA, you want to have a label on there that has the name of the farm and the business address of the farm. If you are covered, then you want to be going to that PSA grower training, getting some help from Pennsylvania Extension. Jeff Stoltzfus, who was on the call last week, is a great resource. He heads up the produce safety education at Penn State. And just get a handle on what it is you have to do. It's much less, the requirements are much fewer than GAP certification, I will say that. But there's a lot, you have to have a good food safety program on the farm. But you know what? No one is exempt. As I said, no one is exempt if they're shown to have made people sick by putting adulterated food into commerce. So if you make people sick with your food, it doesn't matter whether you're exempt or qualified exempt. You're going to be, you're still going to be at the mercy of whatever FDA requires of you. Okay. Let's move on to what is GAP certification. So GAP certification, it may be required by a buyer. And as Morgan said earlier, that's the thing that came up from the buyers that PA FarmLink has spoken to. It is a business decision. It's not the law. So you don't have to do it unless you want to sell to that buyer. Whereas the produce safety rule, you're required to do it if your farming business falls under the criteria that is required, that requires you to be compliant. So what happens with GAP certification is a third-party auditor will come to your farm to audit you once a year. If it's USDA, they might come again to do an unannounced audit, just to verify that what they saw in your first initial audit is what you're still doing the rest of the year. They may even come twice again, depends on how long your growing and harvesting season is. And they're coming to see if you comply with a set of food safety standards. And the foods, there are different versions of these food safety standards. They're based on good agricultural practices. And good agricultural practices are practices and procedures that may reduce the risk of foodborne illness. In the produce safety and the food safety, the produce safety world, we say we reduce risk. We do not say we eliminate risk. You can't turn your farm into an operating room that's completely sterilized. So you can only do the best you can to reduce the risk of foodborne illness. I'm going to get a little bit more into some of the things I said there, but here I have to be GAP certified or FSMA compliant to sell wholesale. So it depends on who you're selling to. Generally, schools, hospitals, and colleges don't themselves require good agricultural practices. So if you're selling into institutional food service, they may or may not require it. You've got to check with each institution. If you're selling into a school district, you check with the school district. I'm working with Frederick Farm to School down in Maryland at the moment, and they are having their farmers get Maryland GAP certified, which I'll talk about later. They sort of see it coming down the road, that even if an institution isn't requiring it now, they probably will be in the future. And a lot of this has to do with liability, especially with big retail chains and restaurant chains. It's their legal department that's saying we don't want to be liable for a foodborne illness on the farm. So we need some sort of assurance from the farm, from the vendors, that they are doing what they need to do to reduce risk. And GAP certification is the thing that is recognized. And then distributors, large retailers, food service contractors are people that, like, I'm trying to think of names right now. Aramark is one. Bon Appetit is another. These are companies that provide the food services in an institution. So they are not, they don't run the institution, they just run the food service at that institution. And so distributors, large retailers, food service contractors, or food hubs often require GAP certification. In the case of distributors and food hubs, who are oftentimes themselves distributors, they are responding to what their buyers, their customers are requiring. And then FSMA compliance, as I said earlier, depends on your business size and scope. At this point, I haven't heard of any buyers requiring FSMA compliance. It's a pity because it is a simpler thing to comply with, but right now GAP certification is still the standard. And then even if you are FSMA exempt or FSMA compliant, actually, your customer may still require GAP certification. So that whatever the customer wants in terms of GAP certification is what you have to do. And getting GAP certified will take care of 99% of the FSMA requirements. So at least you'll be covered for that, but you will still have to get a state inspector come out to your farm. They would be coming out annually. So you're getting a GAP audit annually, and you would get a produce safety or FSMA produce safety audit or inspection. They're calling them inspections so that they don't get confused with GAP audits, one of those annually. The one thing that GAP certification doesn't cover is you still have to attend that PSA grower training to be compliant with FSMA produce safety rule. Now, for GAP certification, somebody on the farm needs to be sufficiently educated about food safety to write a food safety plan and maintain it, and make sure supervise everybody else in whatever food safety role they have. So the PSA grower training in Pennsylvania is really the only GAP training that's happening. There are other trainings, many of them remote. A lot of us went to remote trainings because of COVID. So there are other kinds of trainings out there, and there's a lot of recordings of trainings, of webinars out there. We have some on the ChesapeakeHarvest.com website as well. So just going to take a quick look at the chat. It doesn't look like, doesn't look like anybody's getting GAP certified anytime soon. So if your customer requires GAP certification, what should you do? So one of the things is talking to your friends who may be food safety certified, GAP certified. Visiting farms and facilities with food safety programs in place is always helpful. But number one is get more information. So if the customer is saying, we want you to be GAP certified, what do they mean by that? Do they have a preferred food safety standard or audit program? If they say they just want you to be GAP certified and they don't really know anything about the different options out there, you get to decide who audits what standard you're going to be certified to and who audits your farm. And then in terms of what standard you want to certify to, there are a lot out there. In Pennsylvania, the USDA GAP or harmonized GAP standard is one way to go. There is also this Produce Gaps Harmonization Initiative, which has the harmonized GAP standard. USDA has its version of the harmonized GAP program. Global GAP has its version of the harmonized GAP standard. It is the most sort of flexible, risk-based, farmer-friendly standard out there. So these are all organizations that own their own food safety standard. The Massachusetts Commonwealth Quality Program and the Maryland GAP program are state only. The nice thing about those, if you have, I figured there might be people who are not from Pennsylvania on this webinar, so I put them in here. The nice thing about these is the state gives you a lot of support. I know the Maryland GAP program is completely free. You get trained for free and they audit you for free. And it's kind of, Maryland GAP is it's sort of GAP 101. It's a good starting place. Maryland Department of Ag they work with buyers to sort of market that program. So there are certain buyers who will accept it. I know that Common Market in Philadelphia in the Northeast accepts Maryland GAP. And there are other buyers in the region that do. And then the Commonwealth Quality in Massachusetts is also a very well-supported program that covers you for both the produce safety rule and for GAP certification. These others, Primus, Global GAP, Canada GAP, they all have their own programs. It really depends on what your buyer wants you to do. So you can ask for help. There's my program if you want to understand better which standard you should try to certify to, what to do when a buyer asks you to be GAP audited. Jeff Stoltzfus at Penn State would help, but other co-op extension folks in other states, most states have people that are focused on food safety and produce safety. You could talk to other experienced farmers. So you just reach out. Don't panic and reach out for help. And then, so on this slide, it had these are the different programs, food safety standard programs. On this slide, these are the different organizations that will audit you. So the USDA owns its own programs and does its own auditing, and it has usually a cooperative agreement with most state departments of ag, so that the person that comes out to audit your farm is actually from the State Department of Agriculture. So the Pennsylvania Department of Ag has auditors that will do the USDA audit on your farm. And the nice thing about that is they're familiar with Pennsylvania farmers. They understand the landscape and the challenges that Pennsylvania farmers have. And so you're not dealing directly with the USDA. With these others, NSF, CCI, Primus Auditing Ops, these are just a few other audit certification bodies, they're called, or CBs. They tend to be more expensive. They're usually licensed to audit to different things. So CCI can do Primus, it can do harmonized GAP, it can do, I don't know if it does global GAP. Each of them licenses with the owners of the program, of the food safety programs, to be able to audit. Quality Fresh is interesting. That's a very, very small company. It really was started to do audits in the Amish and Mennonite community. They do a lot of auditing in Pennsylvania because of the Amish community and the Amish co-ops here. They audit their audits are for harmonized GAP. They are probably the cheapest audit you're going to get in Pennsylvania. And the key here is, will the buyer that wants you to be GAP certified accept any of these folks, as the certifying body for your food, for your GAP certification. Just a quick thing on Global Food Safety Initiative benchmarking, so GFSI. Sometimes a buyer will say, well, we want you to have GFSI GAP certification. This means, so GFSI is a nonprofit, European nonprofit, that's basically establishes equivalency between audit programs. And it's a global equivalency. So down here, I've got USDA Harmonized GAP Plus is GFSI. It's called GFSI Government Equivalent because USDA is a government program, whereas Global GAP, Canada GAP, and Primus are they're for-profit businesses. Well, they might actually be non-profits, but they're not government organizations. Primus is definitely for-profit. And they all have programs that are GFSI benchmarked. So when a buyer requires that you have to, it's like another level of rigor and detail. And you kind of have to decide, is it worth my time and energy? Is it worth the return on investment for me to go to a program that is more rigorous? You don't want to start there if you can help it. You want to work your way up from a less complicated program. So, what if my customer requires GAP certification? Basically, I think I say here, take it seriously and get some training. I think you should take it seriously whether or not a customer requires GAP certification. Food safety on the farm is very important. And getting some training just so you know what the possible risks are, what the hazards are, and how risky things are on your farm is really important to know, because you don't want to make anybody sick. I mean, those of us who talk about food safety a lot, we wish it could just be education, that everybody just needed education. Unfortunately, business being what it is, it's gone beyond just people getting educated. But at the very least, you should get educated, and everybody on the farm should understand that they are handling a product that is vulnerable to foodborne pathogens. And so what are the basic things that you need to do to make sure that things are safer and lower risk on the farm? So you want to get somebody, you or someone in a position of responsibility trained, and then you want to train all your personnel. And that means anybody on the farm who has any access to the produce. If it's the children should get trained. And in my experience, children are the most fierce defenders of food safety I've ever come across. And they will point out when their parents are doing the wrong thing all the time. It's pretty funny. So yeah, you want to train your personnel, develop some standard operating procedures. Now this SOPs, they're called standard operating procedures. That's the kind of thing that really helps you actually in a lot of ways in your business. Well, on a small farm, when there's very few people working there, very often it's all in somebody's head. And when I had my catering business, one of the businesses I had over the years, it was really helpful for me to get the procedures down on paper, written out, so that I could go away and do other things. And it's the same with food safety. Once you get something written down, and when you write a procedure, it can include more than just the food safety. It can, if you're doing a harvesting standard operating procedure, you describe how things need to be harvested, including how to reduce risk. If you're doing a washing and packing SOP, same thing. You describe all of that so that people know that process, that procedure from bringing it in and out of the field, if it has to be washed, washing it, how it gets packed, what it gets packed into, and then in that SOP, you're also including the food safety protocols that help to reduce risk. You want to test your water sources to see what you're dealing with. If you're using well water, you want to know, is that well water drinking, is it potable? Is it drinking water quality? If you're using, and if it's not, then you have to think about how you're going to use it. Do you have to treat it? Can you still use it for irrigating your crops? If you're using surface water, ponds, streams, rivers, you can with ponds and with streams and rivers, because the water's rushing by, It's a little harder to get a good sense of the water quality from a test, but at least you get some idea of what the water is like. And in a pond, if the water isn't recirculating quickly, you get a pretty good sense of what the water source is. And then through your process of writing a food safety plan and going through different risk assessments, one of which is your water systems, when you know the quality of your water, then you can take steps to reduce risk. Or you can see that you've already taken those steps. If you're only doing drip irrigation and all of the crops that you're not drip irrigating anything that's typically eaten raw under the ground, so carrots, radishes, etc., then you've got a pretty safe system. So it helps you to understand how many risks you have to deal with on your farm. And then you want to create a traceability system. This is something that's required, and that's a big part of what the buyers who want you to be GAP certified really want you to have a traceability system and a recall program. It's a big deal for them. They want to know if something's wrong, that you've got a system to pull it out of commerce, pull it out of the supply chain, and let them know. And again, talk to your food safety savvy peers, visit farms and facilities with programs already in place. And then once you started to, in the process of writing a food safety plan, you will create standard operating procedures. You will decide what kinds of records, logs you want to keep. You will do a whole bunch of risk assessments around water, animals, raw manure, and so on. And so when I help a farmer write a food safety plan, as Morgan knows, we do it we don't do it all at once. I like to do it in 2-hour sessions, so you can kind of grapple with different things as you go along, and you write. We have lots of templates. There are many templates online, and I use templates. And you can use those templates for the different SOPs and records and risk assessments to customize it for your operation. You don't have to start without anything. There are resources out there for you. And then once you get your food safety plan written, you start keeping the records and logs to document your practices. So again, training your workers, there are training tools out there, and we're waiting with bated breath for Cornell to come out with new videos. They're coming out with 3 new videos sometime this year. COVID really slowed that down. Penn State has this great, it's called a worker training kit. It is a flip chart, but they don't like to call it that. You can buy that online. And then Carolina Farm, CFSA, Carolina Farm Stewardship Association, has some videos. We have videos on ChesapeakeHarvest.com. There are various different places that you can find useful videos. And actually, in the series of toolkits that I am constantly updating on the ChesapeakeHarvest.com website, there are videos from other organizations as well. I try to keep that up to date. And there are also lots of posters that you can print out and laminate that can be used either just on the wall to advise people about things, but also as training tools. And again, as you're going through your food safety plan writing process, you'll be asked to do various risk assessments. And these are really helpful because when you do a risk assessment, you get an idea of what really needs to be done, what really needs, if anything, needs to be changed, if any specific training needs to happen, if any if procedures need to be developed or changed. It can help you to create that action plan that gets you to GAP certification readiness. And so I just had a couple of, do I have more photos? Oh, yeah, here we go. So just some photos here. This one down on the left-hand side, I don't know if you can see, but there's birds' nests right above where the packaging is being stored. Not a great thing. You'll do a risk assessment around wildlife, so groundhogs, deer, birds, etc., and you do your best to try and figure out how to reduce risk. Here you've got someone who's spraying wet raw manure. This could be your neighbor in Pennsylvania. And when are they spraying it? How are they spraying it? Is it going to impact your crops? Or is it your own farm? And is it going to impact the field next door where you're growing strawberries or something? Here you've got, got a really bad case of runoff from animal pens. It's just about the worst thing I've ever seen. Over here, you've got cattle hanging out in the creek where potentially someone might be using that water to irrigate. And then you can see with water, the source determines the water risk. So these are all the things that you're going to be, these are some of the things you'll be looking at in a risk assessment. These are kind of, some of these are worst case scenarios, but they do, obviously they occur, otherwise we wouldn't have these photos. And then my mantra with food safety is make it as easy as possible to do the right thing. So big thing is to tidy up and get organized. When I've done auditing for farms, when I walk onto a farm or I drive onto a farm and I see things are tidy and organized, I kind of relax because I feel like, okay, they sort of have step number one. And it's one of the hardest things, actually. I know this. Farms are so busy. There's so much going on that to be constantly tidying up can be just impossible. So you have to think about, over the off season, can we get things really tidy and organized so that it'll be easier throughout the season? Do we have places for everything clearly identified? So, you've got a nice hand washing station here. You've got a first aid kit there. You've got some signs. Here you've got logs lined up on clipboards. Here you've got a really nice place for harvest bins to be stored upside down off the ground. This is another hand washing station. Here's just a simple way of storing harvest tools so that they stay clean and dry and they're not just thrown into a bin to stay wet and rusty and dirty until the next time you use them. So the more organized you are, the easier it is for everybody to do the right thing. The traceability and recall, as I said, this is very important when you're selling to a wholesale customer. You've got to create that method so you can trace your product from back to the field where it was grown and forward to the buyer that you sold it to. And you've got to decide on some sort of lot number system. This is a very simple one. These tomatoes were harvested on July 24th, 2011 from field number 2. So the lot system doesn't have to be that complicated. And then you also want to check with your customer because they may have specific requirements. One of the things you'll be required to do with GAP certification is a mock traceability and recall exercise. So you've got to test the system to make sure that it functions properly. And then once you've kind of got everything organized, you're going to schedule your audit. And you want to, certainly with USDA, they want to be there when you're harvesting. It's not a convenient time, I will say that. And they want to see as many, you can decide you only want 1 or 2 or 3 crops audited. But if you want a whole farm audit where there's, all of the crops, if you have many different crops going, then you want to have as many crops as possible being harvested and packed when the auditor comes. Now, if you have the same process for harvesting and packing cucumbers, zucchini, red peppers, so on, they're interested in the process. Then you could say, well, you've seen the way we harvested and packed cucumbers. We do the same thing for zucchini. We do the same thing for peppers. We do the same thing for, I can't think what else, summer squash, gold squash. Same with berries. If you're field packing berries and all of your berries are packed that way, you don't bring them back to the packing house to repack. Then if they see one kind of berry being packed, that'll be good for all of the berries if the process is the same. With leafy greens, if you have the same process with all of them, all of your cooking greens are harvested and packed the same way, and so on. And one thing I will say is, if as much as possible, try to field pack things. Try not have to wash things. I won't go into that in detail because we're already at 12:46, but that is something we really highly recommend is if you don't have to wash something, don't wash it, because water is the best vehicle for spreading pathogen. So if you don't use water in your harvesting and packing process, you reduce risk. And then if you want to get a USDA gap audit, there are 2 forms you have to submit. We can put these links in the chat. And basically, the USDA will get from, when you fill out these applications, the USDA will see what state you're in, and they'll be able to connect you with these. If there is a state Department of Agriculture that does the auditing, they can connect you with them. There are some states that the Department of Ag doesn't do the auditing, and the USDA has their own representatives to do audits, their own auditors in those states. And then the other, Global Gap, Canada Gap, Primus, there are different certifying bodies that will do that auditing for you. And the advantage of doing a USDA gap audit is there is money right now to cover 50 to 75% of your audit expenses. So it's great to take advantage of that over the next year or two. The other audit programs do not have any kind of cost sharing unless the buyer provides it. So timeline, people always say, how long will this take? And unfortunately, we always have to say, it depends. So the timeline for GAP certification depends on what your customer requires. Is it a simple GAP standard? Is it a complicated GAP standard? That will make a difference. So that the complexity and scale of the farm also has an impact on how long it will take for you to do everything you need to do to get a food safety plan written and implemented. How many people need to be trained, and in what, and how available the training is. There's a lot of online training now, so it's more available than it used to be. You know, how literate, how familiar people are with food safety on the farm, how much capacity people have to manage, to write and manage a food safety plan, a food safety program, and whether or not whether you try and do it all yourself or whether you have someone come in and help you. And I say realistically, at least 6 months. When I work with people, what I usually do is I start with an on-farm risk assessment. So if I possibly can, I will come to the farm and do a risk assessment with the farmer. And that gives me an idea of what's going on there. It gives the farmer an idea of the kinds of things we need to address. And then what I do, usually, unless it's folks that don't use technology, is, as I said, I'll do these 2-hour sessions over a period of months to get the food safety plan written. And those 6 or 8 or 10 2-hour sessions are also a food safety training for the farmer. And then what will it cost me? Honestly, the biggest challenge is to your brain and your routine. I haven't been to many farms that have to make major changes to be able to get GAP certified. If you want to go, if a buyer is requiring you to go after something like I'm blanking on it, Primus GFS, in the packing shed, there might be a lot of improvements that you have to make. And again, as I said earlier, you have to decide if it's worth the trouble, worth the money, worth the investment, based on what you might earn from that buyer. It's usually not as scary or overwhelming as you expect, especially if you get help. It's very hard, I would say, to do it by yourself, but there are folks like me who will help you. It's usually true that you won't need expensive improvements, as I said. This food safety process is a really deep analysis of how things run at your farm. So it can lead to improved efficiency and higher quality product. And you have to really think, food safety is about quality. It's about the quality of your product. It's not just another thing layered on everything. It is another thing layered on everything that you have to do, but in the same way that you are concerned about plant pathogens, you have to be concerned about human pathogens. And many times the same things you do to prevent the spread of plant pathogens will also prevent the spread of human pathogens. So you're getting a higher quality product at the end of this. And since it's such a systemic change, you want to do it step by step. You don't want to try and do it all in a rush. If a farmer calls me and says, I need to get certified in 2 months, I'm usually really reluctant to work with them unless they're very, very well organized and they've had some training, because I usually feel like I'm setting them up to fail. And you want to make sure that everyone is engaged. So it's not just one person at the farm trying to get everybody else on board and trying to get everybody else to do the things that the food safety plan requires. If you don't have everyone engaged, you're going to fail. And again, if it's too complex or it's too costly and too time intensive, is it worth the return on investment? Someone has to do the work, so you can write the manual yourself or you can pay someone to help you. And I don't say pay someone to write the plan for you, because that I've been to several farms where they have the food safety plan on the shelf that they paid someone a lot of money to write and no one's ever actually looked at it or implemented it. And you can't outsource the management and implementation. You have to do that as a farmer, as a farming operation. You have to actually do it yourself. And the cost of a third-party audit itself will vary. Again, it depends on the size of the farm, the complexity, how far the auditor has to travel. I would say an audit could cost $550 to $3,000 for a small to mid-size operation. And as I said, there is cost sharing with the USDA. So a very large farm gets into the $1,000, or a mid-size, in every state, large means different things, but a good sized farm with a lot of different types of produce and a lot of different types of harvesting and washing and packing procedures, that can get expensive. And in that case, you may only want to audit the 2 or 3 crops that are being sold to the buyer that requires the audit. So I created this chart that gives a comparison between GAP certification and FSMA produce safety rule. Connor can put the link to that in the chat so that if you want to take a look at this, if you want to download it, you can. I say at the bottom here, this is not an exhaustive comparison. There are more details and requirements not included here, but it gives you an idea of where things are different, where things are the same. And, oops, is that the end? I thought I had another slide. What's going on? Okay, that other slide has gone away. Oh, here we go. So there's some contact information. I will put my email in the chat. And also, so we've got a few minutes left for questions, if there are any questions.
Thank you, Lindsay. I'm not seeing any yet, but we have a couple minutes if any pop up. Actually, I think I had a couple I wanted to. So it sounds like the next step, you have some great programs at Chesapeake Harvest to work with farmers to help walk them through approaching GAP certification and writing a food safety plan. Is that first step just to reach out to you or Aaliyah with that contact info to get that started?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
That's what I thought. Okay. And then you brought up the PSA grower training. Of course, that's related back to FSMA compliance. Did you say, does Penn State Extension run those? Or how could people look up like the most upcoming PSA trainings if they need to get compliant with that aspect?
You know what? Let me find that right now.
Perfect.
Because you can go on the PSA website. And there's 3 ways of doing the trainings. You can do them in person, and the only one I've seen in Pennsylvania that's coming up isn't until February. but they also have a remote training. There are a bunch of remote trainings out there, and there's also an online version. The online you do in your own time. The remote one is just, it's a live training, but it's remote. And then the in-person one obviously is in person. The main difference is the in-person one is 1 day and that's it, you're done. The remote is, I think, usually over 2 days, half a day each. The online, they say it takes 15 to 30 hours to complete. So I think they probably have some extra, to make sure they know that you're actually doing the training, they have some extra exercises in there for you to do. But it's probably a pretty thorough training program to do it online, and you can do it in your own time. So let me just find the Grower Training course page.
Awesome.
There we go.
I remember when FSMA first came out, it seemed like there was a whole bunch of these trainings, obviously, to get people up to speed. And a lot of them were free through a grant program. So now they're still out there, of course. It's just a little bit harder to find them than it was when it was really getting heavily promoted.
Right, there were tons of them happening, and they're still subsidized, so it's good to do them while they're still subsidized, because once these subsidies go away, it's going to cost at least $150 to do one of these trainings. Now they tend to be around 50 or so. I think this is, let's do training. Yeah, we'll do that this page. Go training courses. Okay, I'll put this in the chat.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, so that's something that folks can go check out. If you learned through this presentation that you are covered by FSMA, and it's a great food safety training and introduction to food safety, regardless, really. I've been through it, and it's a really solid foundation, like before you would jump into the rest of GAP certification, writing a food safety plan. Thank you. Okay, so through Cornell, makes sense. I think those are the questions I had. I don't see any other specific ones in the chat yet. But thank you so much. I feel like I still learned, been through some of these, but I've still learned things today. And I think, I mean, if I could surmise some of the things that Lindsay touched on, at the end of the day, you know, food safety programs are the right thing to do. None of us want to make folks sick. It's the right thing to do in terms of maintaining quality and our brand and reputation as producers. And I think that's a valid point, that it actually can even increase efficiency and help you scale up from a labor and efficiency production standpoint by having these SOPs and getting organized. There's certainly room for all of us to do a little bit better job with that as producers, as farmers, regardless of where we're at with our business. So you can find all of the resources that we put together through this, especially crop block grant through FarmLink. Of course, please reach out to Chesapeake Harvest, Penn State Extension, Cornell, all of those great programs. And yeah, thank you so much to Lindsay and Chesapeake Harvest, and Connor for helping with the technology side.
Thanks, Morgan. It was great to be here.